We have. I've walked many miles, I suspect, and we're grateful you're here. We live for people who care about these things, and so you enrich our lives very much by being here. Thomas Jonathan Jackson was mortally wounded in these woods on May 2nd, 1863. It's not my job here tonight to talk specifically about that. Greg and Frank will bring you through that story, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about this man, this great American icon. It strikes me that the difference between our treatment of historical icons like Jackson and our treatment of merely famous Americans is this. For merely famous Americans, we are satisfied to understand their deeds. For icons, we seek a vision, we seek to understand the person, replete with all sorts of personal details, and almost all of them, always, flattering. Thomas Jonathan Jackson is, of course, an icon, not universally, but largely. You can visit his house, you can stand in his living room. Museums across the South are filled with items, both military and personal, that belong to Jackson. One museum keeps a drawer full of items donated to that museum on the assertion that Jackson was carrying them the night that he was wounded here in these woods. Probably 30 pounds of stuff. Books on the Civil War, on the Confederacy, and on Jackson are full of stories that personalize him. His widow, Mariana's memoir, was and remains one of the most popular books ever written about Jackson, largely because it is full of that personal detail, large and small, that paint a picture of Jackson as a person. Stories like this one, Mariana tells. Of course, just 2 weeks before this day in 1863, Jackson met his daughter, newborn daughter, 6-month-old, for the first time, Julia, at a place called Belvoir, about 8 or 10 miles from here, off to my right. Jackson, of course, had never had a baby before. He was new to the business, and watched somewhat bemusedly as, when Julia became fussy, his wife, Mariana, would pick her up to comfort her. And then when his wife took Julia to put her back down on the bed, Julia started to fuss once again. Jackson exclaimed, "This will never do!" And he instructed all hands off. Mrs. Jackson later wrote, "So there she lay, kicking and screaming, while he stood over her with as much coolness and determination as if he were directing a battle. When Julia ceased her wailing, General Jackson would pick her up. When she started again, he would put her down." Mariana wrote, "And this he kept up until she was completely conquered and became perfectly quiet in his hands." The perfect soldier is also the perfect parent. Anyone who has had a baby will recognize the immensity, if not the impossibility, of Jackson's accomplishment, conquering in minutes what mankind had sought to master for centuries: how to soothe a baby. Of course, I read this and I think, okay, well, let's really see how he would have done when she was 15. He is also, Jackson, in addition to being a perfect parent, has been hailed as the perfect Christian, the perfect husband, and even a reconciler among races, though he hired slaves himself. For our great heroes, for someone like Jackson, we presume, even demand, that the deeds that made them famous are matched by the virtues that would make them icons. We want and presume universal excellence, virtual perfection, something that men like Lee and Jackson would have been the first to deny. We gain a great deal as a nation by having and knowing our heroes. But we lose something too when we forget that in more ways than not, they are just like us. We are all a ledger book of virtues and foibles. Without war, and possibly without Robert E. Lee, we would not know Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Perhaps in his hometown of Lexington, Virginia, he would be remembered, but then as a common, pious, middling man of religious intensity, active conscience, and mild, often overstated eccentricities, who was largely deplored as a teacher by his students at VMI. Jackson, like most of our heroes, rose to excellence only when his particular form of excellence was demanded. Jackson also shares this with his fellow icons, be they Confederate or American or both. He rose by virtue of accomplishment rather than machination. He represents the triumph of substance over gesture. Indeed, gesture and pretension were entirely foreign to him. One soldier wrote, encountering him on a battlefield, he said, "I found him half sitting and half lying against the trunk of a small pine tree. He was a man of medium size, wearing a shabby gray coat, and on his head was an old blue cap. Across his shoulders was a strap made of calico, and attached to the end of it a bag made of carpet, such as schoolboys use for their books. He wore a pair of army boots. I should judge the size to be about size 9. Thomas Jonathan Jackson was a man far more interesting than attractive. His social awkwardness was legendary, and apparently rightly so. Alternately, the cause of discomfort among those who witnessed it and amusement among those who witnessed it. He was relatively humorless, entirely humorless when business was at hand. It's unlikely any of you would have enjoyed hanging with Thomas Jonathan Jackson. One soldier wrote of him, "There is a magnetism in Jackson, but it is not personal. All admire his genius and his great deeds, but no one could love the man for himself. He seems to be cut off from his fellow men and to commune with his own spirit only. He performed with machine-like efficiency, entirely committed to duty, demanding the same of those around him." One of his staff officers one day commented to him rather offhandedly that he hadn't been away from the Army since the day he joined 2 years before. Jackson responded, "Very good. I hope you will be able to say so after the war is over as well." He possessed supreme confidence in himself, but sometimes almost no confidence in others. He was, in fact, a control freak. He constantly kept information from his subordinates, treating them like unthinking parts of a machine. He was a consummate antiquarian manager, autocratic, uncommunicative. He delegated little authority. He discouraged initiative, facts that drove his subordinates to distraction. He created a culture of management in his organization within which he himself could not have thrived. We would never have heard of Jackson had Jackson been commanded by someone like Jackson. He demonstrated repeatedly an almost otherworldly focus on the task at hand. One soldier was assigned to go out and give him whatever he needed during a bridge building process on the Rappahannock. The soldier wrote out to him and he said, "When I reached the abutment, we were the only 2 persons who were out there, and so remained for an hour, during which no word passed between us." Can you imagine? An hour with no word between us. The first person who swam out was A.P. Hill, but General Jackson was so abstracted and so rude that he turned around and went back without any commands or instructions. I stood all day by the general, out on that abutment in the sun, but I do not think he addressed a single remark to me. Of this awkward, sometimes rude, humorless man, one of his men serving in the Valley with him in 1862, wrote this: "I had rather be a private in such an army as this than an officer in any other." So why? What was it that inspired men to follow Thomas Jonathan Jackson into these woods that night? They had an abiding faith and trust that when he asked them what to do or to do something, there was reason, and more importantly, there was a great chance for success. They had faith, and so they followed. None of us, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, LeBron James, Barack Obama, none of us are destined to success, because invariably those around us have to give us the opportunity. Circumstances have to call upon us. I've often wondered what would be Wayne Gretzky's fate if he grew up in Florida, or Bryce Harper in Alaska. We would never hear of either of them. They would be just like us. The great good fortune for Thomas Jonathan Jackson and for the Confederacy was Robert E. Lee. A man with a completely different management style. He encouraged the very things, initiative, independent thought, that Jackson discouraged in his own men. Lee recognized in Jackson many things that we often do not. He did not accept the theory of the universally positive, of the universally qualified, of the universally excellent Jackson. He, like most wise managers, looked at this man and picked of his skills that which served him best. And one of Lee's great skills was assigning the right work to the right person. And Jackson was often the right person. He could see plainly that Jackson's great successes on other battlefields before he came to Chancellorsville were not born of brilliant performance on the battlefield. His victories on the battlefields in the Valley in 1862 had been either one-sided rollovers or precarious. His performance in the 7 days had been poor. Once on the field at Second Manassas, Jackson had struggled. Indeed, when Lee came to Chancellorsville in 1863, Jackson had not a battle on his record where his performance on the field itself would mark him as great. Instead, Lee saw clearly the reason for Jackson's great success. The Valley, Second Manassas, at both places, he had taken a situation that looked hopeless and created opportunity with rapid marches and incredibly hard work that confounded his enemies. On May 2nd, 1863, Robert E. Lee faced similar circumstances here at Chancellorsville, though on a much closer scale than in the Valley or at Second Manassas. A vastly larger Union army, apparently immovable, invulnerable, in trenches around Chancellorsville. Lee needed to create opportunity, and so he turned to Jackson, not because of his record of tactical brilliance, but because of his boldness. Lee and Jackson shared little in their management styles, but they shared many qualities in their professional minds. Imagination, a thirst for the initiative, a desire not just for victories, but for destruction of the Union Army. And both had a high tolerance of risk. But most importantly, Lee and Jackson shared the courage to act. Theirs was a rare relationship that added value to the talents of both. And so, early on the morning of May 2nd, 1863, 150 years ago, around a fire at a bivouac 2 miles from here, Lee and Jackson decided to act more boldly than they'd ever dared to act on a battlefield before. When they parted that morning, Jackson led with 2/3 of the army, on a risky gambit that would take him to this place where both the pinnacle and end of his military career awaited him.
"150 years ago at this very moment, the woods around this simple country crossroads would have echoed with the sounds of battle. I think I will continue, but there we go. I wasn't sure how long to wait for that before going on. Over the next few minutes, my mission tonight will be to get you oriented to some of the landmarks that will be important for our story, and also to tell you about some things important to providing context leading you up to the moment when Jackson would go on his famous reconnaissance. Among the landmarks, easiest one to recognize is what you can hear in front of you. The traffic moving along what is today Route 3 was historically the Orange Turnpike. It actually went by two different names because while originally the Orange Turnpike, it would get sold to another company that decided that the best road surface was a plank road. And in many places here in Spotsylvania County, the Turnpike and the plank road are distinctly different roads, but 1 mile to the east of us or off to your left, the plank road comes into the Chancellorsville crossroads. It runs right on top of the Turnpike in front of you, and then about 1 mile or so to your right in the area of Wilderness Church, it forks off again. So I'm going to be referring to this road as the Turnpike, but if Frank or anything you read refers it to the plank road, they are correct as well. Between you and the Orange Turnpike, about 40 yards or so in front of you, is another road called the Mountain Road. You will see that illuminated tonight. It is an older road than the Orange Turnpike. The next road to point out is one that all of you parked along and walked down. That paved road just a little bit to the west of us is known as the Bullock Road, and it was here at the time of the Civil War, leading to the Bullock farmhouse about 1 mile behind you. So those being the key landmarks, next I want to mention a little bit about the vegetation. We're in an area known as the wilderness. The wilderness doesn't get its term from the same reason we use it today. It was not an area untouched by man, but one that was heavily touched by man, cut down on multiple occasions, predominantly to fuel iron furnaces in the area, and so we have a second growth coming back up. Not as many tall, mature trees as you see today. Tallest trees about 30 feet tall, a whole lot of underbrush. And perhaps the closest description out of all the soldier descriptions of the wilderness and the Battle of Chancellorsville, the one describing a feature literally closest to us, is a little bit ahead of you and to the right along the Orange Turnpike. And to help set it up a little bit, later on, some Confederate soldiers would approach this area marching in column, and they came under cannon fire. And they sought to go into the woods on either side of the road to complete their march. Here's what one of the Confederates had to say about trying to do that. He said, "On each side, the shrubbery was so dense as to render it impossible to march." So keep that in mind for the vegetation. Also important to our story tonight is something that the Union Army did to the landscape. About 300 yards to your right or to the west of us, into the woods today, a trail leading to the remnants of it, are some Union earthworks. Union earthworks built earlier in the battle and not in use on the evening of May 2nd. because by this time, the Union Army does not have the right end of its line 300 yards away from us, or on the afternoon of May 2nd. As many of you know, it was 2 miles away from us. The Union Army changed their lines by this time, with the right flank resting vulnerably 2 miles away from us. But for these older earthworks 300 yards away from us, not only is there a pile of dirt in front of it, but most important for our story and understanding why Jackson will be in this area, is because they had cleared out about 50 or 100 yards in front of those earthworks to give them a field of fire. So in front, I'm meaning to the west of that mound of dirt. And the Union soldiers would take the brush left over from cutting down those trees, take it to the far edge of their clearing and kind of stack it up to form an obstacle, or to borrow a phrase from the French, abattis, that would slow down any attacking forces at a point where they were very vulnerable to the fire. Again, only 100 or 50 yards in front of the works. So in addition to the roads, the vegetation, the earthworks, the last factor I want to mention is the moon. May 2nd was 1 night shy of a full moon. So what that means, there's plenty of light out to see figures moving in the dark, but clearly not enough light to make out what color uniforms those people might be wearing. So 150 years ago today, Thomas Jonathan Jackson began his day conferring with Robert E. Lee and ending up the Cracker Box Conference. He began his march, the 12-mile march that many of you followed today on a bus tour. And when Stonewall Jackson neared the end of his march, he was met by Cavalry Brigade Commander named Fitzhugh Lee. Fitzhugh Lee had discovered an open hill where he could get a good view of the Union position that Jackson was about to attack, and invited Jackson to go along on a reconnaissance with him. Now, because Jackson would be on a reconnaissance here tonight 150 years ago, I think it's rather interesting to make a little comparisons with the various reconnaissances that Jackson went on. He would go on 3 reconnaissances on May 1st and 2nd combined, 3 in 2 days. Now, the very first one was the previous day, 150 years ago yesterday, on May 1st. It was a reconnaissance from the Catherine Furnace area up to Hazel Grove. The circumstances at that time is that the Confederates did not have a firm idea as to where the Union Army was. And when you're going into an unknown area that could be dangerous, these men that went on the reconnaissance wanted to make sure they had plenty of firepower to deal with whatever they might come in contact with. Jackson was on the reconnaissance, so was Jeb Stuart, but they brought along with them a regiment of cavalry, a regiment of infantry, a battery of artillery. All in all, probably 700 or 800 men went on this reconnaissance into an unknown area. And it was important that they did so because they came under Union cannon fire. On this particular reconnaissance, 150 years ago this afternoon, Jackson was going into an area that had already been secured by Confederate cavalry. Confederate cavalry made sure that there was nobody around, but since Jackson was going on an open hill where he might be spotted and might give away what was going on, Fitzhugh Lee suggested that Jackson bring only one courier with him. So this time Jackson going on a reconnaissance with one other person where he could take a look at the Union position. After making that reconnaissance and seeing exactly where the enemy that he was about to assault was positioned, Jackson continued his march and then began to line up his men. Jackson had to strike a balance that afternoon between how many troops he would need and how much daylight he would need. If he waited until all 28,000 of the troops that he took with him on the march got into position, he would have had virtually no daylight in which to make an attack in all likelihood. Suppose, for example, he took the first of his 3 divisions when those 7,000 to 8,000 men got into position and moved forward, when he clearly would have plenty of daylight, but would he have enough troops to pack the punch that would not enable the Union forces to shift, change positions, and react to it? For Jackson, at about 5:15 that afternoon, with some 18,000 men in place and only about 2 hours of daylight, Jackson unleashed his forces. Looking back with hindsight, you might wonder, should he have taken a few more troops and allowed himself a little more daylight? But that's one of the fun things about history, but we will never know. So Jackson launched his attack at around 5:15. And if you were standing here on that particular night 150 years ago, probably your first evidence that Jackson had launched an attack was to see fleeing Union soldiers going from your right to your left, heading off in the direction of Chancellorsville. Some of the Union soldiers tried to stay and fight, but their position just jeopardized their ability to resist. Others were able to get into pretty good positions, but they were just so overwhelmed by Jackson's numbers that they didn't stand a chance either. It's those fleeing Union soldiers that would have gone by here that first gave Union headquarters an idea of the flank attack. You may wonder, well, couldn't they hear the fighting before they saw any of the evidence of troops coming by? Well, at least as far as at the Chancellorsville intersection, there was an acoustic shadow in effect. The men at headquarters could not hear the battle going on some 3 miles to the west. The first inclination that anybody at the Chancellorsville Inn had, where again federal headquarters was located, was when one of Union General Joseph Hooker's staff officers named Harry Russell was looking to the west, and he simply declared, "My God, here they come," as he saw the men run out of the woods into the Chancellorsville opening. The scene that they saw there and the scene that you would have seen here that particular night is one described by a staff officer, Washington Roebling. He wrote, "A curious sight met the eye, a multitude of yelling, struggling men who had thrown away their muskets, panting for breath, their faces distorted by fear, filled the road as far as the eye could reach." Some of the people noted that many of these soldiers that were retreating were German and spoke in German accent. One of the apparently common questions that they asked the people that they passed is, "Wo ist der Pontoon?" looking for the pontoon bridges. Joseph Hooker realized that he needed to do something to brace his command to head off this attack that seemed to be coming toward him. For him, his old division, for Joseph Hooker, his old division, commanded on this day by Hiram G. Berry, was nearby, and he took those troops from the Chancellorsville clearing and sent them into the woods coming toward us. His instructions to Berry were interesting. How would you instruct men fighting at night to go and stop enemy soldiers coming at you? Hooker said to Berry, "General, throw your men into the breach, receive the enemy on your bayonets. Don't shoot, they can't see you." And as some of the men went into the woods, passing by Joseph Hooker, sitting at the Chancellorsville clearing on his white horse, he occasionally called out to the men, "Receive them on your bayonet, boys. Receive them on your bayonet." They would eventually stop to set up a defensive position about 600 yards or so to the east of us, or to your left, and those men would quickly go to work with axes and picks and shovels to prepare defensive works. That is the line that Jackson would investigate when he eventually went out on his reconnaissance. So while Joseph Hooker was sending troops coming toward this area from the east, there are also some troops to the south of us, directly ahead of you. Many units in the Union 12th Corps and the 3rd Corps had advanced on south in the area of Catherine Furnace. Many of you went on tours related to that today. Those men eventually got word, without any evidence. Obviously, Joseph Hooker had, again, the fleeing fugitives going through his clearing, but those men to the south, rarely did they run into any fleeing 11th Corps forces. They got word that there was something wrong up here, that their help was needed, but without the evidence, many of them approached this area completely ignorant of the situation. The first such unit to be able to respond from the south is one that could move very quickly, a cavalry regiment. Cavalry from the 8th Pennsylvania Cav. And none of these units had any idea what they were approaching, and the route of the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry was on a road that still has a trace that it is in existence today. It was a road that came from the Catherine Furnace up through Hazel Grove and came into Route 3 in the area where the Wilderness Camping Resort is just to the west of us. Now, those of you that are going on the early morning program tomorrow, that is where you're going to be parking. Some of you will experience the same road that I'm talking about. So the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry started to advance down that particular road. Again, coming in, turnpike up just about 800 yards to the west of us. Now, whenever a cavalry unit is moving into an unknown area, they're going to be riding in a compact column, but we'll have some individual soldiers out in front and on their sides to give them some warning if they're going to encounter danger. But the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry and their commander thought that they were riding within the safety of their own federal lines. No need for any kind of extra precautions like that. So they were riding down that road of the Wilderness Resort in columns of 2, so about 2 men wide and about 200 or so deep. As they got a little bit closer to the Orange Turnpike, their commander, Pennock Huey, noticed some men in gray uniforms. And his initial thought was, oh, these are probably some federal scouts that dress in Confederate uniforms, acting, as spies. But then as he got closer to the road, he saw large numbers of men in Confederate uniforms and realized that he was in trouble. He also felt it was too late for him to turn around and go back. So he continued on forward. His first thought was, when I hit the road, I'm going to turn to the right to the east and ride to the Chancellorsville intersection, where federal headquarters was located. But when he started to do that, he found there were even more Confederates blocking the road. So he turned in the other direction to the west, and there, after riding about 100 yards, ran into a lot of Confederate soldiers. Saddles were emptied as the men tried to cut their way out, some of them turning back, riding east toward Chancellorsville, some of them turning down the Hazel Grove Road, and any of them heading into the woods wherever they thought they could get a little route of escape. Now, to take a look at this cavalry action that occurred right here, I wonder the true impact of this. Because for the Confederate forces, this cavalry seemed to come out of nowhere. The Confederate infantry was lined up perpendicular to the turnpike, north and south, and they are facing eastward. They are prepared from an enemy force coming in from the east. And it just so happened the Pennsylvania cavalrymen rode between a couple of north-south lines as they rode to the north. So Confederate soldiers probably wondered, where on earth did these cavalrymen come from? It makes me wonder if they're going to be extra suspicious of horsemen that particular night. These federal cavalrymen would not be the last federal troops to move from the south and encounter Confederates who are anticipating the enemy coming from the east. Why is it that the Confederates stopped at this particular point? Remember those earthworks that the Union Army built some 300 yards off to the west of us? And that abattis, that thick abattis that they put up at the edge of their clearing. That's what the Confederate battle line ran into as it worked its way to the east. Robert Rhodes, the division commander in charge of the front line, had this to say when he wrote his official report. He said, "The right, becoming entangled in an abattis near the enemy's first line of fortifications, caused the line to halt. And such was the confusion and darkness that it was not deemed advisable to make a further advance." So again, that abattis is what caused Confederates to come to a stop right here. As these Confederates that are now halting in this vicinity to your right and front are trying to organize themselves, there are some other forces that have not yet formed into battle line but stayed in the road in marching column that have followed the battle line up to this point. And riding along with some of those men was the victorious commander of this attack, Stonewall Jackson. An adjutant of a Georgia regiment described what happened when their commander approached them, and you might imagine what that would be. After a victorious attack like this, the men cheered. That Georgia officer said that the earth seemed to, quote, tremble as if shaken by an earthquake. The cheering is so tremendous, caused by General Jackson riding along the line. Another unit that reported cheering General Jackson at, quote, about twilight was the 18th North Carolina, the most prominent regiment in the Army on this particular night. A very unique role, as we shall see. And they noted that when they cheered Jackson, that he took off his hat in recognition of their salutation. The 18th North Carolina were part of a brigade commanded by James Lane. Everybody in that command was North Carolinians, and they were part of a command from A.P. Hill's division. When they came to take over their position in the front line, that was going to be their job. These fresh troops would take over from the men that had been fighting or trying to reform and get out of the tanglement of the abattis. But as these men tried to come forward, they found that taking over the front line was no easy task. Just as they had arrived at the front, 3 Confederate artillery pieces went into position in a small clearing around the schoolhouse along that same road at the front of Wilderness Resort. The Confederate cannon opened fire on the North Carolinians when they were still marching in column along that turnpike. And Federal guns from Fairview off to your left would have responded. The shells began falling in this area, and Lane's men reported that these artillery projectiles were landing here as thick as hail. Some of them said that they had never experienced such shelling. Lane ordered his men to lie down, but many of them had already done so or tried to dive into the bushes on the side. And the quote that I shared with you earlier about the wilderness and the heavy bushes on the side comes from this particular time period. Jackson and Hill, interestingly, seem to ignore the artillery fire and are talking throughout it. But for James Lane trying to put his men in position, he felt that they couldn't possibly do so unless something was done to stop that cannon fire. So with a member of A.P. Hill's staff, they eventually convinced the Confederate artillerymen to stop firing, and when they did so, after about 15 minutes, the Union Army stopped firing as well. We have a little bit of a lull now in the action, if you will, and now is the time for Lane's men to go into position. Lane has 5 North Carolina regiments. One of them is the 33rd North Carolina. They will pass through this area, go to your left, east of us, to form a skirmish line, an advanced thin line to warn the main line of any potential enemy attack. And again, they are preparing for an enemy approach from the east and no other direction. The other units, the other 4 units in Lane's brigade, 2 of those units, those regiments, formed to the south of the Orange Turnpike. 2 of them formed to the north, and the ones forming to the north, I think, undoubtedly made use of that little lane, the Bullock lane, to try to get into the woods a little bit easier. The unit that would be immediately to your right, just beyond where our visitor center is located, was the 18th North Carolina. Jackson issued orders to his commanders on what he wanted them to do. But for Jackson to have a true understanding of what he would be doing that night, he needed to find out what was in front of him. He needed to go on a reconnaissance. Unfortunately for him, to help him out that night, there was a local man named David Kyle who was here to assist. David Kyle was 19 years of age. Kyle happened to be a local boy. He grew up elsewhere, but was orphaned at age 11. Went to live with an aunt, and his uncle's name was Peter Dowdall, who ran Dowdall's Tavern, a landmark some of you may know of. That stood 1 mile to the west of us, to your right. And then, as he lived there with a sister, when that sister eventually got married, she married a man named Oscar Bullock. The Bullock Road, again, to your right, named for him, and the farm that I mentioned 1 mile behind you, the Oscar Bullock Farm, is where he lived in the years just before the Civil War. This man lived in 2 locations, 1 mile north and 1 mile west of this spot. Apparently a venturesome fellow who, it was said, knew where every hog path went. That is a man that went along with Jackson that particular night. And Kyle would help lead Jackson on his 3rd reconnaissance again in 2 days. As Jackson prepared to go out forward, one member of his staff, Sandy Pendleton, asked a question that many of you may have wondered. General, don't you think this is the wrong place for you? Jackson's response was, the danger is over. The enemy is routed. But Jackson was wrong. The enemy was not completely routed. Jackson had only routed the smallest of the 5 Federal Infantry Corps upon the field. And as far as the danger being over, danger was all around him that evening, even emanating from a source from which he would least expect it.
In the darkness, shadowy figures started to move towards the front. 150 years ago, this very moment, chaos reigned in these woods. Federal troops tried to regroup and form some semblance of a defense just a couple of 100 yards to your left. Shortly, Jackson's men would approach from your right, reaching the Bullock Road beside you. Though victorious, they were just as badly disorganized as the Federals they had pursued. Stonewall Jackson had no choice at this time but to break off the pursuit and reorganize his troops. Up to this moment, Jackson had pressed his attack in hopes of driving Major General Joseph Hooker's Federal Army out of Chancellorsville and north across the Rappahannock River. But reaching this point, however, gave Stonewall Jackson another interesting and daring alternative. The Bullock Road beside you marks the high water mark of Jackson's success this night 150 years ago. He was only 1 mile away from Chancellorsville. He was only 2 miles away from Robert E. Lee and where he had started this day before launching a 12-mile flank march and a brilliant flank attack at dusk. Bullock Road, however, did not point east to Chancellorsville. It pointed to the northeast, behind Chancellorsville. It offered access to the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. It offered access to Hooker's line of communication. And it offered access to Hooker's line of retreat. Jackson had been pressing east towards Lee up to this time, but now he changed his emphasis, and he angled his attack in an entirely different direction, orienting it 45 degrees off to the northwest. He didn't want to drive the Federals out of Chancellorsville. Now, he wanted to get behind Joseph Hooker and make sure the Federals never got out of Chancellorsville at all. But the Confederates had to overcome a number of major obstacles. They were tremendously outnumbered on this battlefield. They were outnumbered almost 2.5 to 1. And they could only make a decisive strike against the Federals if they had caught the Federals disorganized and unable to defend themselves. This evening, Jackson had routed the 11th Corps, and he had the Union Army reeling. This was a small window of opportunity for him to strike, and he was quick to take advantage of it. There are two things that Civil War soldiers positively hated in this world. They hated to fight at night, and they hated to fight in woods. And Stonewall Jackson intended to have them do both of those things this evening at the same time. In preparation, Jeb Stuart's cavalry was already heading towards Ely's Ford on the Rapidan River, ostensibly to vex and harass Hooker's rear echelons. But now, they had a much more important role. They were supposed to block one of the two critical exit routes for the Union Army off this battlefield at Chancellorsville. Stonewall Jackson talked to Major General Ambrose Powell Hill, AP Hill, about the other exit route, counseling him to press forward Hill, cut them off from the United States Ford, slightly to the east of Ely's. He asked Hill if he knew where the United States Ford was, and Hill admitted that he was not familiar with it. So at that point, Jackson ordered his chief engineer, Captain James Keith Boswell, to join Hill and show him the way. Jackson turned to the North Carolina Brigade that was already starting to form along the Bullock Road, and he approached their commander, Brigadier General James H. Lane. "Push right ahead, Lane," he said, "right ahead." And for emphasis, he raised himself out of the stirrups of his horse and thrust his fist forward, willing himself forward towards the enemy. But before Jackson could launch his final attack, he needed to answer several vital questions, and he needed to answer them quickly. Would the Federal Army indeed make a stand? If so, where would they make a stand? Which way would they face? Would they dig in? Would they fortify? And if they did so, how could he exploit them? Jackson was racing against time at this point. Every minute that his troops reorganized was a minute for the Union Army to also organize in these woods. So not to waste any moment, Jackson gathered a small coterie of staff officers and couriers and a guide, the young man that you heard from Greg Mertz, David Joseph Kyle, who headed off to reconnoiter in the front. Together there were 9 horsemen who entered these woods in front of you, heading towards Chancellorsville. Besides Jackson and Kyle, there was Captain Richard E. Wilborn, a Signal Corps officer. There was Captain William Fitzhugh Randolph from the 39th Virginia Cavalry Battalion, who was in charge of giving couriers to the generals. Lieutenant Joseph G. Morrison was Stonewall Jackson's aide-de-camp and also his brother-in-law. Jackson had married his sister Anna. William E. Cunliffe was a Signal Corps soldier, as was W.T. Wynn. Among the couriers was Joshua O. Johns of the 39th Virginia Cavalry Battalion and Lloyd T. Smith of the same unit. Jackson was unfamiliar with the ground here at Chancellorsville, and he imagined that he could only go to the front by moving along the Orange Turnpike. But the road was macadamed, and though neglected, it had washouts and it had sinkholes, but the rock surface was still very evident in some places, and it formed a reflective surface that literally glowed in the luminescence of a near full moon rising over this battlefield. David Kyle suggested that Jackson could not get very far on that road before he would be spotted. Instead, Kyle knew of a better way to get to the front, a stealthier way that they could move undercover. He offered Stonewall Jackson a nondescript little woods path, a byway that had proceeded and paralleled the current highway and was used by the locals as a bypass around some of the rough patches on the Orange Turnpike. It had the rather ostentatious name of the Mountain Road, and theoretically, it started around Fredericksburg, and a long, long time before now, it carried Native Americans and European colonists into the interior of Virginia and towards the mountains of the Blue Ridge and beyond. Uncertain, Stonewall Jackson allowed Kyle to take a large lead ahead of him. But once he was satisfied that David Kyle knew what he was doing, Jackson quickly overtook him and joined him. And this would be Stonewall Jackson's last ride. Tonight, the pinpoints of lantern light in front of you mark Jackson's passage down that mountain road. As Major General A.P. Hill's men started to fill the woods on either side of the Orange Turnpike to your right, General Hill faced a bit of a dilemma at this point. Hill and Stonewall Jackson had had a long history of a fractious relationship. In short, they were diametrically opposed to each other. They had bickered about each other. Hill had been even arrested by Jackson, and they had court-martial proceedings pending against each other. Several had tried to intercede to patch up that relationship, and they had failed. No less than a person than Robert E. Lee himself tried to be an intermediary and also failed. But according to Jackson's ubiquitous mapmaker, Jedediah Hotchkiss, allegedly, sometime, somehow, on the way to entering into this campaign, the two generals had somehow managed to patch up their differences and amend past differences and become one. Now, even if that was true, theirs was still a very precarious relationship. And at this moment, A.P. Hill learned that Jackson was reconnoitering to the front, and that made A.P. Hill nervous. Because this was A.P. Hill's front, and this was A.P. Hill's job. According to a staff officer, as soon as Hill saw Jackson ride in front of the lines, he felt it was his duty as a subordinate to join him, and accordingly, he rode forward too. A.P. Hill quickly gathered a group of horsemen, staff officers and orderlies, 10 horsemen altogether, and also pressed east towards Chancellorsville. But A.P. Hill didn't have a guide, and he didn't know about the mountain road, and he ventured down the moonlit Orange Turnpike. While there were 19 horsemen moving out in front of the lines at this point, Brigadier General James H. Lane attempted to complete his brigade's battle line in preparation for the next phase of combat to begin. He had thrown the 33rd North Carolina ahead as skirmishers, as you heard from Greg Mertz. He had formed his brigade straddling the highway. He had expanded his flanks, penetrating the woods both north and south of the highway. And as he expanded that front, his troops ran into pockets of Union resistance, troops that had been blown loose from their units, disoriented and lost in the woods. He had also encountered elements of the Union 12th Corps, which was returning from their sojourn down in Catherine Furnace and Hazel Grove. A Union Brigadier General from Pennsylvania known as Joseph F. Knight was moving through the woods, thrashing, looking for his division commander, Alpheus S. Williams, as he called out repeatedly, "General Williams, has anyone seen General Williams?" The Pennsylvanians with him suggested that he should be more circumspect about what was going on in the woods and be more cautious. The general thought there was no danger in these woods, and the Union commander, according to his men, raved in language more forcible than polite when they encouraged him to pipe down. As he moved further to the front, he encountered the 33rd North Carolina, not very far away from us. As he shouted for General Williams, the Confederates recognized they had no General Williams, and they responded by firing at the disembodied voice. The Pennsylvanians responded in kind and fired back, and General Knight was in between, caught in the crossfire. Miraculously, that general survived, though he lost his hat and the better part of his dignity trying to get out of the way. Almost exactly at that same moment, a Union colonel approached Lane's main line off to your right front. Lieutenant Colonel Levi H. Smith of the 128th Pennsylvania waved a white flag and entered the 7th North Carolina's line. Naively, good-naturedly, he explained that he had lost his men and just wanted to make sure they weren't them. He was genuinely surprised when they didn't let him return to the woods. According to one Confederate, he was little better than a simpleton. But it was an abuse of the white flag, and as a result, they held Colonel Smith, and Lane sent out a detail to scour the woods, and they found his regiment for him. And they captured over 200 of them, right in front of Lane's line. Simultaneously, yet another encounter with Federals occurred on this line. A sergeant named Thomas A. Cowan of the 7th North Carolina was in charge of the picket line south of the highway. As somebody came thrashing through the darkness towards him, he told him to halt and give the password. The man admitted he didn't know what the password was, to which Cowan answered, "Well, are you friend or foe?" And he got the unsatisfactory answer, "Friend." So Cowan asked, "To which side?" And the man answered, "To the Union, of course." And Cowan's company responded with a volley, which triggered a volley in return. 3 firefights erupted almost simultaneously across several hundred yards of Lane's line south of the highway. These impromptu firefights were in no way related to each other, but in the darkness, no one could tell how many Federals were in those woods, or in truth, how few. They didn't know who was out there. They didn't know whether they were related, if they were connected, if this was purposeful or by accident. And as a result, Lane's line assumed that their pickets had been compromised or captured, and this was a major Union counterattack. They responded as they should. The 7th North Carolina opened fire to clear the woods and across their front. When they fired, the 37th North Carolina to their left also picked up the fire, and the fire started to spread down the Confederate line like electricity, heading towards the highway. A.P. Hill broke off his reconnaissance and started back. He got within 60 paces of that line in an urgent pace, dead gallop, which to the Confederates of the 18th North Carolina did not look unlike the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry and their cavalry charge early there that night. Dozens of Confederates in these woods to the right started yelling, "Cavalry charge!" And the 18th North Carolina opened fire on A.P. Hill, cutting down the entire group, which fell in a heap of writhing men and horses opposite the Van Wart house just across the highway. Hill was the only one to escape being shot in either the body or the horse. Meanwhile, Stonewall Jackson had completed his reconnaissance and was on his way back, silently moving down the mountain road. Staff officers trailed behind him, riding in pairs, and the signal officer, Captain Wilborn, rode next to Jackson. There was a moment of great confusion in these woods. In the darkness, riders broke away from the mountain road and set off, bolting in every direction. Lieutenant Joseph Morrison, Jackson's brother-in-law and aide, dashed from the coterie of groups and started directly towards the line. Heading for the 18th North Carolina, he shouted out, "Stop firing! You're firing into your own men!" Major John Decatur Barry of the 18th North Carolina was somewhere out there in the darkness, and he heard this command and was shocked by it. Somebody was usurping his command, and he shouted back, "Who gave that order? That's a lie. Pour it into them, boys." Stonewall Jackson was wounded 3 times at this moment. In that entire group riding with Jackson, only 5 bullets found flesh in this darkness. Out of a group of 9 horsemen, Jackson had a very good chance of coming out of this unscathed. And yet 1 bullet had penetrated the upper part of his left arm, about 3 inches below the shoulder, and broke the bone before exiting out the rear of the arm. A second bullet also struck the left arm, hitting near the elbow of the same left arm, and passing diagonally for about 5.5 inches before it exited near the wrist. A third bullet, deflected off a tree perhaps, lost some of its velocity, its momentum, and caught Jackson right in the palm of his right hand, which he had up shielding his face against tree limbs. It caught him at the base of the thumb and went through the thinnest part of the entire anatomy, but it was the only bullet that stayed lodged inside the body. Jackson's horse reeled off the mountain road and headed towards the Orange Turnpike. Captain Richard Wilborn immediately chased after him. A low-lying tree branch caught Jackson square in the face and gashed his cheek badly, but somehow he managed to stay in the saddle. Wilborn, shortly afterwards, was able to corral Jackson's horse and brace the general as he started to reel. Unfortunately, Wilborn had been wounded earlier in the war and had just returned to active duty, so as the general fell against his weakened and wounded arm, both of them fell out of the saddle and hit the ground. Others started to come out of the darkness. Still others started heading towards the main line, trying to silence the fire and stay the darkness. A.P. Hill was immediately notified that Jackson had been wounded, and he joined Jackson out in the woods and helped brace him and helped take off his gauntlets that were filling with blood. A doctor was brought out from the main line, Dr. Benjamin P. Wright of the 55th Virginia Infantry. He took a look at the wounds and helped see that they were bound. But it was difficult to get at Jackson's wounds because they had to cut through a raincoat, and they had to cut through a uniform coat of wool, and they had to cut through 2 shirts before they could get to the wounds. But eventually they were able to bind those. They brought a stretcher out, and it became imperative to get Jackson out of here because he was still between the main lines. As they tried to put him on a stretcher, Jackson thought he might be strong enough to walk and started towards the main highway, walking away from you. But he had only gone a short distance before the loss of blood had left him dizzy and he had to sit down. He consented to be put on a stretcher. They took him down to the main highway, figuring that that was the easiest way to get him out of the woods. But upon entering the highway, they ran into yet another problem, a firestorm of artillery. Something of what one historian called a Confederate passion play occurred along the Orange Turnpike at this time. One of Jackson's attendants, carrying him to the rear, was struck by the shrapnel that was teeming from the Union guns. John James Johnson of the 22nd Virginia Battalion had both his arms sliced clean open by shrapnel. One arm would be amputated that night, and the other one would be crippled for life. He dropped his end of the stretcher, and they dropped Jackson who landed on his wounded arm and gave out a terrible groan, the first and only time he had let on that he was in pain. They kept Jackson pinned to the ground as Union artillery continued to wreak havoc on the woods where this fire had erupted. And they paid particular close attention to the highway, the most logical avenue of approach for their Confederate attack, and conveniently, where Jackson was located. As Jackson tried to rise, staff officers like James Powers Smith forced him back to lay down for his own protection, for his own safety. And when the fire lifted and shifted elsewhere, Jackson was hurried into the cover of the trees on the other side of the road, where they eventually made their way into the Confederate lines. Jackson tried to go to the rear anonymously. He ordered the group around him to gather in close so people would not be able to observe him. When they were asked who it might be, they were supposed to respond that it was a friend or an officer. But as Jackson headed towards the rear, a North Carolina general named William Dorsey Pender suspected who was in the group. He recognized some of those in the group and imagined Jackson in the middle. As he pushed his way through the group, he came face to face with the wounded general. He was sorry to see Jackson wounded, but he was also looking for orders. He explained that the Union artillery was wreaking havoc with his troops and confessed that, "Sir, we are very much broken up back here, and I fear I'm going to have to pull back." Jackson sat up and glared at Pender and told him icily, "You must hold your ground, General Pender. You must hold your ground, sir." And with that, Jackson collapsed, exhausted, and they carried him off the field. It was the last battlefield command of Stonewall Jackson. Shortly behind the lines, an ambulance was acquired, and Jackson's medical director, Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire, was able to climb into the back of the ambulance and see his chief badly wounded. They took him to a field hospital near the Wilderness Tavern, and were probably there within the hour. But they didn't dare operate because Jackson had lost too much blood. He'd lost perhaps 7 units of blood, over half his blood count. And according to McGuire, he was nearly pulseless. They waited until about 2 or 3 a.m. on the morning of May 3rd, when Jackson showed some audible responsiveness and could answer simple questions, before they went ahead and administered chloroform and probed his wounds. They extracted the ball from his right hand and put a splint on it, but the left arm was so badly damaged they had no recourse but to actually amputate it. They took it off 1 inch above the highest wound, just 2 inches below the shoulder. Jackson spent all day May 3rd in a field hospital within earshot of the battle going on at Chancellorsville. But on May 4th, he was evacuated on the direct orders of Robert E. Lee. He was taken 27 miles to the south-southwest, where Stonewall Jackson passed away just 8 days later. But he didn't die of his wounds. He died of pneumonia. 19 horsemen entered these woods 150 years ago tonight, and only 7 of them came back unscathed. 5 of those men who entered these woods were killed or mortally wounded, like Jackson's chief engineer, Captain James Keith Boswell, who had been shot twice through the heart while riding next to A.P. Hill. The most affecting loss of them all, of course, was Stonewall Jackson, and his loss would be felt almost immediately within hours. May 2nd had been a day of decisive Confederate success, and Jackson's maneuvering and guile had gained a great advantage at a minimal cost. And tomorrow, May 3rd, would be different. Starting at 5 a.m., the most atrocious bloodletting ever experienced by either of these armies would begin. These woods around you would be transformed into one of the worst abattoirs of the Civil War, a virtual killing field. And the success of the maneuvering on May 2nd would be replaced by frontal assaults and sheer will and excessive losses.